So we've been studying about fear versus faith, and the theme we've been looking at is from what Jeremiah wrote in Lamentations chapter 3. And when he writes Lamentations chapter 3, he goes through this terrible list of bad things that are happening, these terribly frightening things that are happening. But his conclusion is, in speaking about God, great is your faithfulness. And today what we'll be looking at is fear says, I can't. Faith relies on God's power. Anybody ever say, I can't because we're afraid to do something? I didn't think I was the only one that ever thought that, okay? But again, fear is defined as an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous, likely to cause pain or a threat. What is more dangerous than being asked to do something you've never done before and you don't think you can do it? That's pretty threatening. To me anyway. I mean, it feels threatening. Fear actually causes emotional and physiological responses. I've been reading a lot online about fear, and it's amazing what it actually does to your body. The hormones, the endorphins, all these things that are released, the stress hormones, the changes it makes in your brain to where your frontal lobe kind of starts to shut down. It's not working well. And so there's decisions that are made. Well, the problem with fear, the biggest problem with fear, isn't the emotion, isn't the physiological responses, it's the action that it causes. And that's what God addresses over and over when he says so many times, do not be afraid, because God knows we're not just going to feel the feeling of fear, we're going to do something with it. And usually we're going to do something like, I can't, or something like that. And also even just small fears can build up and fester and cause problems and discouragement. I mean, sometimes those are the worst because they kind of build up and then they get all tangled up, and then you're kind of like, well, I know I can't do this, but I'm not sure why. But it's all these things that kind of build up and they cause problems like discouragement. And I've read a lot, well, I say a lot, but because there's so much out there about fear. It's such a prevalent problem in society, and there's a lot written about it. But discouragement is part of fear. That discouragement, that feeling of I can't, it's part of fear. Someone define discourage or discouragement for me. What do you think of when you think of discouragement?
Loss of hope.
Loss of hope. Very good. That checks off one. Okay. What do you think when you think of discourage? Yes.
By the way, I'm sorry, Gertie was on the top of my list and I didn't mention it at all. Okay, go ahead.
All right. Other definitions of discourage.
Well, it's suppressing our courage.
Yes. Look at the word dis and courage. Okay. Dis means take away. If the root word, I don't know where it comes from, but dis means take away, and then courage. So you got those two, take away, courage. It literally, the two words are put together to mean take away courage. So it's part of fear. And this is one time when the definition that you read from Webster's of what discouraged means actually agrees with the Bible, because so many times I've looked at definitions and it's kind of, well, that's not what the Bible says about this. But yes, discourage is a loss of hope, loss of confidence, because when you're feeling confident, you're sure, you're firm. You lose that, then you lose that firm footing. And Paul writes about that. Stand firm. Again, but that idea of taking away courage. So discouragement, that loss of confidence, that loss of courage, and sometimes it's easy to see what's discouraging us, and other times, it's just an accumulation. It just kind of like builds up over time and just gets to where it just becomes this burden, that it becomes this weight of discouragement, and it's all tangled up and hard to define. And a problem that's difficult to define is difficult to fix. But fear leads to discouragement. This is actually a quote I found online. Fear leads to discouragement. Discouragement leads to fear. It is a vicious cycle of discontentment that can be difficult to unravel and solve. Discouragement just kind of comes in, sets up shop, and makes itself at home in us sometimes. I mean, anybody else, that ever happened to anybody else? It's kind of going, things are going well now. Why am I feeling this way? But because it hangs on, it becomes a weight on us. We're going to look at how Nehemiah dealt with discouragement. Any comments about discouragement before we get going here?
Just thinking, I get discouraged.
Mm-hmm. We're going to hit that. Turn to Second Chronicles, because we're going to get a little of the history first. I haven't gotten to do history in forever, so it's exciting. All right, Second Chronicles. I swear this Bible. I am still trying to get used to this new Bible, or Sam's Bible. Sam's copy just does not have things. All right, page 350 when it should be 500 or something. All right. So because of sin and after years of warning, I mean decades of warning, God allowed Babylon to defeat Judah and destroy Jerusalem. And in 2 Chronicles 36, the entire city was leveled. 2 Chronicles 36, verse 19, it starts here with a description of what the Babylonians did. Then they burned the house of God and broke down the wall of Jerusalem and burned all its fortified buildings with fire and destroyed all its valuable articles. And those who had escaped from the sword were carried away to Babylon, and there were servants to him and to his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days of its desolation it kept Sabbath until 70 years were complete. All right. So now, I don't know if anybody has seen the pictures recently of the fire in Lahaina, Maui. Picture that devastation, and that's Jerusalem at this point. They have utterly destroyed it, knocked down the walls, destroyed the temple, destroyed all the buildings. It's ruins, and nobody lives there for like 70 years because God says, no, I mean, you're out of here. So we also read that, and starting in verse 22, that after that time, the Jews were allowed to return and rebuild. And it's the Persian Empire by now. Babylon has been taken over by the Persians. And it's estimated in Ezra chapter 2, because Ezra picks up immediately after the end of Second Chronicles. It's estimated that about 50,000 Jews returned. Now, that's not, most of them stayed in Babylon. I mean, after 70 years, you're no longer captives. So many people have been born and raised there. That's their home. But it's estimated about 50,000 returned. Now, 80 years later, Ezra leads a second group of Jews back to Jerusalem. And now in all these decades, and there has been an intense opposition to the Jews coming back in and rebuilding. Now, all the neighboring nations, that at one point, Israel was the power in that area, and God gave them victory over all of their enemies. These neighboring nations, it's kind of, hey, I kind of like seeing Jerusalem in ruins, and people come back and try to rebuild, and there's intense opposition. And so all this time, so much so that the walls around the city have never been built. 80 years, and the walls haven't been rebuilt. Now they've laid the foundation for the temple. They've started. I think they rebuilt that in Ezra's time. But again, and in ancient times, walls were your security. Walls were your police force. They were your home alarm system. They were the main protection against robbery, crime, any enemies. So we have Ezra going back, and turn over just a couple of pages to Nehemiah. And about 10 years after Ezra takes that second group back, Nehemiah finds out just how difficult life is for Jews in Jerusalem. Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 3, he's asking, hey, some people come from Jerusalem, and he says, hey, what's going on? How are people doing there? And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach, and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. Okay, the people are surviving, but barely. Imagine you have no protection, and any group of bandits that comes along, they can just take whatever you've got. They can take your, I mean, if you read through Judges, you read about how at the time of Gideon, that any band of the Moabites would just come along, or it's the Ammonites, but they would just come along, and it's like, oh, you've got a little bit of food, I'm taking that. And so this is the situation that they're in. I mean, it's just a constant sense. There's no security, there's no protection. They're just in constant danger from any roving band of enemies that just say, hey, you've got some stuff, I want it, I'm taking it.
Does it mean that some of the people did not leave? Because it says they survived the exile.
Yes, but well, there was only a few that there's only a certain number of Jews that went back to
Yeah,
Jerusalem.
I know they
Yeah.
went back. So this doesn't mean that they stayed
No,
there
yeah.
even from the beginning of the capture.
Right. So it's kind of like,
It means they went back.
right. The destruction of Jerusalem was so intense that
Nobody.
just so many people died. And then there were the captives, most, some people were left that were outside Jerusalem probably. But most of the people were taken to Babylon. And then, so and it's kind of like, here we've survived all of this, and now we go back to Jerusalem, and we're going to barely survive being in Jerusalem again, even though we're being allowed to return. So there are no walls, no protection. Imagine being a father and you have no idea how to protect your wife and your children from the roving bands of bandits, because again, the Persian Empire is in charge now of all these little nations, but the Persian emperor, he's interested in taxes, and so his army is for protecting the border, protecting the king, and gathering taxes. What you guys do amongst yourselves, I don't care. Okay, so long as the taxes were paid, the army wasn't there to protect citizens. The army was there to make sure the taxes were collected and that the borders were secure. The Jews are part of this Persian Empire, and they're kind of left on their own to provide their own protection. That's why you need a wall around your city. So they're living lives of constant stress and tension. I mean, it's a pretty bad situation. By the time the news gets to Nehemiah, this is about 100-year-old problem. Because remember, you've got 80. You've got the first group that goes back 80 years later. Ezra takes a group back. This is 10 years later after that. So 100 years from the first time that the first group of Jews returns, the wall is still not built. The gates are still there. I mean, imagine 100 years later, and these wooden gates that have been burned down and broken by the Babylonian army, and they're just still there, a constant reminder of the destruction. Well, they're just the opposition that they faced was so great. Now, after that long, I mean, imagine walking by, and it's kind of like if you're walking around and you see trash on the side of the road, and you just see it every single day, and after a while, it's just kind of like, oh, that's just there. Can't do anything about that, because if I pick up trash, then more will just be tossed down. And it just seems like they got to the point that they just kind of accepted this is how things are. It's a hopeless case. Yeah, I can't. And that brings us to point one, that doubts and fears can build into discouragement and make us decide that we can't. It would seem to me that after 100 years, they were just kind of like, well, we can't. If you haven't been able, but they haven't. But every time they tried to, the neighboring nations would oppose them, would write nasty notes to the king, and the king would say, okay, no, you've got to stop work on this, or just different ways that they put them in danger. So they've spent 100 years, and they haven't, they've been able to rebuild some houses and stuff and rebuild the temple, but it's kind of like, well, the protection is still not there. And I imagine after that long, well, we can't. We just can't do anything. It hasn't happened by now. After 100, it just can't happen. The opposition is too great. We can't. We're too few. We can't. Whatever the reason was, the job is too big. I mean, imagine having to clear out all that rubble and replace everything. We don't have the resources. We don't have the manpower. We can't. I mean, there's all kinds of things that would go into that discouragement that would get the Jews who were there in Jerusalem to the point of, we just can't. In the next generation, huh? Yeah, I know, but the next generation comes along and well, our parents can't, so we can't. I mean,
but we are not in fear of our lives,
and
yet we feel sometimes hopeless, or we just can't get out and teach other people.
Yeah,
because I'm talking about me.
Because those doubts and fears, they build up into a discouragement. It's kind of like, well, it didn't work before, or I tried to talk to somebody and they're just kind of, oh, not interested, and it makes us decide that we can't. So after decades of opposition from their neighbors, it seems like the Jews gave up on rebuilding the wall and just kind of, well, this is just how it is. It's always been this way. It's always going to be this way. We give up. We can't. And they believe what they've been hearing for so long. Well, you just can't. Now Nehemiah has a different response. Yeah, in verse 4, it came about when I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Okay, we can't, we're not doing a study on Nehemiah. I'm just using him as an example here, but he's a great one to read. Nehemiah's response: the walls have to be rebuilt. The people are in such distress. Nehemiah, a Jew, he wants to do something about it. And he's going to. What's the first thing that he does? He prays. Starting in verse 5, he has this prayer where he says, I've sinned, we've sinned, please forgive, please. I mean, he's saying, I need, it's kind of like, oh Lord, and verse 11, oh Lord, I beseech you, may your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant. Give me success. Because he has to go to the king. Sorry? Yes. Yes. And again, the first thing he did was pray, and then he plans, and then he acts. And we're going to see this repeat with him, because again, he works for the king. I mean, he's in a high position in the court. He has to go to the king for permission. There's no supplies. The Jews don't have what they need to rebuild the wall. He has to ask the king for those supplies. And so he has this plan in mind, but it's kind of like, it's scary to go to the king, because the king at that time is kind of like, oh, I like you, you get to live. Oh, I don't like you, you get to die. I mean, that's how it was at that point, just very literally. If the king didn't, I mean, and it'll say, and we'll see God answering that prayer, because when he goes to the king in chapter 2, his face is still sad. He's been mourning for days, and the king's kind of like, wait a minute, why are you sad in my presence? I mean, at one point there was a law, you can't be sad in the king's presence. On pain of death. It's kind of like, because you might bum out the king. So he prayed to God, and then verse 4, and then the king, and so and Nehemiah says, well, my home area, the gates are, the walls are down. Let's see, verse 2, why is your face sad, though you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart. Then I was very much afraid. Again, probably I don't know if it was this particular kingdom, but at one point it was illegal on pain of death to be sad in front of the king. Yeah. Well, he said he wasn't sick. He said, you are not sick. Yeah. He was very afraid. He said, this is nothing but sadness of heart. And I was very much afraid. And I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate, and the gates have been consumed by fire? Then the king said, what would you request? Okay, now Nehemiah had planned for this, because he had prayed. Now, it doesn't say that he planned, but he had an answer ready. Okay, he prayed to God. He said, God, give me, where does he say? Right. Oh Lord, I beseech you, may your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant. Make your servant successful today, and grant him compassion before this man, the king. Okay. So he prayed specifically, God, give me strength, give me courage, make the king give me, make the king do what I want to give me the supplies and the time that I need. And then God gives him the opportunity. The king asks, Nehemiah may not have wanted it to be at that exact moment, but God gave an opportunity, and Nehemiah was ready to take advantage of that opportunity. And so he told the king what he needed. And the king tells him, it's going to go, hey, how long are you going to be gone? And he gives him a time. And so he was ready to answer these things. The king says, what do you need? Or first the king says, what's going on? He's ready with an answer. The king says, what do you need? He's ready for an answer. He has planned. King says, how long are you going to be gone? He gives an answer. He had planned. He hadn't just said, oh, God, do something, and sat back and waited. Okay. He had planned. Okay. And so he prays, he plans, he acts. And we're going to see this pattern of behavior repeated with Nehemiah over and over. Every time he faces opposition and discouragement, he prays, he plans, and then he acts. Okay. As soon as he sees that opportunity. So then we see Nehemiah going to Jerusalem with this third group of returning exiles, where he runs into continued opposition. It's pretty discouraging stuff. I mean, just, he's got a letter from the king, he's got supplies and all this kind of stuff, and he gets there and there's immediate opposition from leaders in the area. and it's got to be discouraging. And you know, I think it was in Ezra that the opposition was telling Ezra, it's kind of, give us the names of the people who are doing this rebuilding. We're going to write a letter to the king. We're going to get you in trouble. And in fact, we're going to try to get you dead. I mean, that's the kind of opposition and discouragement that the Jews had been facing for decades here. Any comments before we're going to get into chapter 4 in just a minute here?
When we think about it, these people had families to care for, and the mothers and the children. Just think of the torture, physical, mental torture that the mothers and children went through, and all that there was around them that was desolate.
Yes, because you built your house, and yet you're seeing rubble from, you know, the walls are rubble, the gates are burned, and you just see that every day. It's just kind of like, you know, it is discouraging to just see that day after day, year after year, generation after generation. This is still all, I mean, you know, picture that the survivors in Maui, if they didn't clear that out, if they didn't rebuild that, and even if it is completely rebuilt and everything, they're going to look around, they're going to see what was lost. You know, that things like that. You know, I don't know how old that banyan, that tree is that's very famous there. All these things, you're still reminded of those losses. It's still discouraging. Okay, we're going to get into point 2 with Nehemiah chapter 4, where fear would discourage us. So if we can get past the I can't, okay, the first point is, you know, discouragement, fear, that'll just get us into I can't. Well, you know, hopefully we can get past that. If we get past that, then fear would discourage us and make us stop doing good works. So we've gotten past the I can't. So Nehemiah is past the I can't. He's ready to go. He's got the supplies. He's got the permission from the king. But now the people around, they're going to try to discourage him to stop the work. All right, Nehemiah chapter 4, verses 1 to 3, please.
But it so happened when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, that he was furious and very indignant and mocked the Jews. And he spoke before his brethren in the army of Samaria and said, what are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete it in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish, stones that are burned? Now Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him and said, whatever they build, even if a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their reproach on their own heads and give them as plunder to a land of captivity.
Thank you. All right. So the work and the workers are ridiculed. You ever try to do something good and it's just kind of like, you're kind of dumb for even trying that, because you know you can't. I mean, that's very discouraging when you hear that. So, and we see in verse 1 that doing God's will can make people angry. I mean, you would think, oh, I'm doing a good thing. Why are people upset about this? Well, Jesus warned us about that in John 15. I'm just going to go ahead and read a couple of those words. John 15, starting in verse 18, Jesus says, if the world hates you, you know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you are of the world would love its own, but because you are not of the world, I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. It's kind of like, well, I'm trying to do a good thing. Why are people so upset? And it's kind of like, but yeah, Jesus warns us we should not be surprised by this. But here we have the people around, the nations around, getting angry that someone has come and is actually going to finally do something about these broken down walls and provide protection for the people living in Jerusalem. Verse 2, it's kind of like, you feeble Jews, you can't do anything right. That's very discouraging. The work you have done is worthless. I mean, even what you're trying to do, it's worthless. And when you're told, it's kind of like, you can't, you're dumb, you're what you've done, you're worthless, what you've done, it just doesn't work. That makes someone feel like giving up. It's discouraging. And the leaders, and we see here the leaders in the neighboring nations mocking the work and the workers and trying to discourage them. Let's go ahead and read verses 4 to 6, please.
Here,
For we are dispersed, turn back their taunt upon their own heads, and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. Do not cover their guilt, and let not their sin be blotted out from the sun, for they have provoked thee in anger for the builders. So we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to have its height, for the people have none to work.
Thank you. All right, so there's these very discouraging words, and actually, kind of, these are leaders of the nations around there saying these things, and there's taunts and all this kind of stuff. The workers are too few. The job is too big. We should give up. I mean, that's a very easy thing to say, right? It's kind of like, well, it's just too much. There's not enough of us trying to do it. It's too big a job, and it's not going to work anyway. I mean, it's easy to get discouraged like that because we're afraid, because I can't kind of niggles in the back of our brains because, but here Nehemiah, again, the first thing he does is pray. Now, Nehemiah, probably his inclination was, well, I'll go and I'll smack you a good one. It's just the Sanballat and all that kind of, I mean, it's because he's bad. When you read those words, it's kind of like, this is what he wants God, don't forgive their iniquities, not their sin. I mean, he wants something bad to happen to Sanballat, but it's kind of like, okay, give it over to God. He's praying. He's kind of like, okay, don't get distracted. Pray about it. And he prays a rather, vindictive prayer, but it's kind of like, okay, he's giving that over to God. He prays, turns it over to God, and the people keep working. So again, Nehemiah prays, he plans, he acts. It's kind of, okay, nope, I've got to let that go. Fine, they're being discouraging. Turn it over to God, let it go. Focus on the work, because that's another way that discouragement works, is that we lose our focus. And then it's kind of like, oh, well, I have to answer every criticism, or I have to go, or I have to, defend everything. And it's like, no, focus on the work. And that's what Nehemiah does. He prays, get him, God, basically. And then, yeah. And then he said, so that he can focus on the work and on the workers. So the people in verse 6 keep working. Now the wall gets built to half height. It's not finished. It's half finished. That's a dangerous time, right? When a work is half finished. But after 100 years, this is amazing that it's half finished. Okay. It's fantastic progress, which of course brings more opposition. I mean, when is a good work in the most danger? When it's halfway done, when you've gotten past the first excitement and you're into the work, and then it's kind of, okay, now it's just kind of hard, and there's opposition. People kind of like, I don't know, all this kind of stuff. And that's when a good work is at its most vulnerable. Yeah. The excitement kind of fades away, and it's just work now. And then there's opposition, and it's discouraging. And how do you keep going? So let's go ahead and read verses 7 to 9.
Now, the Gileadites and the Arabs, the Canaanites and the Asherites heard that the wall of Jerusalem was being restored, and the gaps to be closed. They became very angry. All of them conspired together to come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion. Nevertheless, we made our prayer to our God, and because of them, we set a watch against them day and night.
Okay. So when words are enough, remember these guys in these surrounding nations, it's kind of like, hey, if I see something I want in Jerusalem, I can just walk in and get it. There's no walls to stop me. There's no, there's just a few people there. I mean, and they had their own history with Israel. They remember David fighting against them. And so they're kind of like, they like seeing Jerusalem in the state that it's in. It's kind of like, wait a minute, you're rebuilding. We don't like this. It makes them angry. But when words are not enough to discourage the work, the opposition threatens to attack. Now, this is beyond words and discouragement and all. This is actual, we're going to go and we're going to take swords and we're going to jump them. But you see in verse 9, the more Nehemiah is attacked, the more he turns to God. And it says again, we pray to our God. Okay. First thing he does, and then the next thing he does is grab your swords. Okay. Make a plan. So first thing he prays, and then he plans, and then he acts. But the more Nehemiah is attacked, the more he turns to God, the more determined he is to do God's will. And the solution to those attacks, fears, discouragement is to pray, plan, and act. Let's go ahead and read verses 10 to 14, please.
Then Judah said, the strength of the laborers is failed. There is so much rubbish that we are not able to build the wall. And our adversaries said, they will neither know nor see anything till we come into their midst and kill them and cause the work to cease. So it was when the Jews who dwelt near them came that they told us 10 times, in whatever place you turn, they will be upon us. Therefore, I positioned men behind the lower parts of the wall at the openings, and I set the people according to their families, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. I looked and arose and said to the nobles, to the leaders, and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, wives, and your houses.
Thank you. All right, so you've had this exterior opposition, this exterior discouragement. Now it's going to be from the inside, okay? Because in verse 6, the people had a mind to work. Verse 10, fatigue kind of sets in. It's kind of like, well, we've been working and it's not getting any easier, and now it's just drudgery, and the shiny new has worn off, and it's kind of like, well, now it's just work. It's not exciting anymore. Now we just got to keep going. They're only half finished. There's so much more work to do. And not only that, all the prep work they have to do. I mean, they still have to clear out all this rubble and everything. It's just discouraging.
It's amazing when you think they didn't have to say it.
Oh no, I mean, you're talking about loading it on a wagon by hand and carting it off. It's kind of like, so and just think about this cleanup even that hasn't been done in 100 years. It's just this constant reminder of what happened, of what they lost. I mean, every day going out there and doing this, it's kind of like you're reminded of what they lost. I'm sorry. Yeah. But again, so they're fatigued. The job is too much. And when they're most discouraged, their enemies plan to attack. And then you have the discouragement from within. The Jews get in a panic. And they come to Nehemiah and say, our enemies are all around us. They're everywhere we turn. It's hopeless. We're helpless. We can't. Okay. So not only does Nehemiah have everybody outside saying you can't, you can't do it, you feeble people. And then now he has the people of the Jews themselves agreeing with it. It's kind of, they're right. We can't. It's hopeless. We're helpless. They're in a panic. And you see Nehemiah's very practical, deliberate response. Kind of like, get your swords, get back up there and keep working. I mean, as you keep reading through Nehemiah is awesome. He says, you got a sword in one hand, you can work with the other hand. Come on, He has Nehemiah, a very important official in the king's court. He had arrived with a bunch of servants. Those servants were put to work. They weren't taking care of Nehemiah's needs. They were working, and he had them working out there. I mean, he is such a practical guy, but he starts with prayer every time. And then he says, get to work. All right. Very practical, very deliberate response, but he's aware of the people's fear. And he says to them, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight. I mean, wouldn't you love it every time that a good work gets started in a congregation, people kind of get to that that discouragement point, the shiny news worn off, that someone would stand up and say, don't be afraid of what might happen. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and keep on going. I mean, that would be fantastic. Any comments? Okay. Well, what about today? Anybody ever get discouraged? Anybody? And again, those doubts and fears that they build into a discouragement, and they can make us decide that we can't. Maybe we've heard you can't. I mean, it's real hard to get past that. That so much time had passed since that first group of Jews had been there, and the walls still weren't built. The rubble hadn't been cleared. And discouragement is effective because it has just a little bit of truth in it. The Jews were few. The work was slow, and they would not be able to return Jerusalem to what it was before. So that, so what's being said, it has that little bit of grain of truth, and then it kind of spreads into, well, then we can't. If we can't do this, if we can't make it perfect, well, then we can't do anything. Fatigue, frustration. This is another quote that I found. Fatigue, frustration, fear, and failure can discourage God's people from doing good works, even to the point of giving up and deciding we can't. And then assuming that we can get past I can't, which is challenging in itself, because there's, we all have history with people saying, well, this won't work. And well, that doesn't work. Yeah, we tried that, but it doesn't work. And so it can be challenging. We've got to get past that first I can't. And then fear would discourage us and make us stop doing good works, assuming we can get past I can't in the first place. Then that fear is still there. That discouragement is still there to try to keep up, to try to stop us. Halfway through finishing the wall, when the workers were most discouraged and frightened, that's when the attack happened. There's lots of reasons for quitting a good work. People get past that first excitement, and I mean, things like, I remember hearing in high school, it's like, well, I used to, someone was talking about some good, I forget what the good work was, but it was something in the church, and I heard someone say, well, I used to do that, but I retired. It's like, and I remember in high school thinking, a Christian retired without dying? Wait a minute, I thought a Christian's retirement was heaven, that you don't retire until then. But it's so easy to get discouraged. I thought you were putting your hand up, but again, I think of my mom, and she went from being able to teach ladies class and a kids class, and just as time went on, just less and less that she was physically able to do. Very easy to take limitations like that and say, well, I can't do anything, and she refused. She it's like, okay, I can send out cards. She got to the point where it was difficult for her to write a message in the card, because she just had so little energy that we would be on the phone and we would talk about, what stamps that I would use on the inside for a message. And, I'd figure out what she liked, and, we would, it would be something that we would talk about, because she could still sign that card and address it. And but not stopping. And so when I think about hearing that person, and it was not an old person that said that either, it's probably someone younger than I am now, saying, well, I used to do that, but I've retired. It's like, what? You stopped doing a good work? You're physically able. I'm looking at you. But again, sometimes it's just tempting to stop working because it's discouraging when so few people do the work. It's like, well, I've been doing the same thing for so long. I remember we moved to California. I'm 23 years old. We moved to California. The person, little congregation, and the person who was teaching basically a one-room schoolhouse for the kids' classes saw me and said, I quit. She had been stuck in there so long, no one had ever given her a break or even thought of giving her a break. And maybe she didn't say, I need a break, but she was discouraged and she said, I quit. And she never taught another kids' class while we were there, because she saw me coming in. But it's discouraging when so few do the work. And that's another reason that we start something good, and it's like, well, I just can't do it anymore. I've been doing it too long or something. Actually, the one before wasn't a quote. Here's a quote that I read. The devil doesn't have to kill most Christians to stop them working for God. Discouragement, compromise, money, relationships, frustrations, or personal trouble stops many from serving God. That's a pretty comprehensive list there, but it's a pretty effective list.
That I've done, it comes true to me that human nature has always been the same. You can
Absolutely
see the same characteristics
absolutely
all through the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Human nature explains us, but it does not excuse us.
Right, exactly. That's very good. I'm going to repeat that for these, because this isn't working this morning. But human nature explains us, but it does not excuse us. I like that very much. That brings us to point 3. Faith enables us to do good works no matter how discouraging our circumstances. And we see from Nehemiah, he turned to God every time someone or something tried to discourage him. And I kind of like old Nehemiah. It's kind of like, he took that anger. It sounds like he was mad when the workers were discouraged. It sounds like he got mad about it. But instead of him taking his entourage and doing something about it, he turned it over to God. He had some suggestions for how God could take care of it, but he turned it over to God and he kept working. That's an amazing person there who can let go of those things, let go of that anger, and focus on the work and focus on the people who are working. He prayed, he planned, he acted. And God didn't allow anything to take away Nehemiah's courage. Nehemiah could have chosen to let those things discourage him and come back to the capital city and to the king's court and said, well, I tried, I'm back. It's much more comfortable here. But no, but he didn't allow that. And God didn't allow that. Nehemiah didn't choose that. Okay. And God didn't allow things to get to the point that were too much for Nehemiah. But Nehemiah made the choice. And that's the important thing. The interesting thing to me about Nehemiah is that he never claims to be a prophet. When you look in chapter 1, he says that he was in the capital city, that he worked in the king's court. I haven't read through Nehemiah recently to be positive, but I'm pretty sure that he never says that God spoke to him directly in any way, in a dream or a vision or anything. Nehemiah is just like us. He saw a problem, he saw a need, he prayed about it, and when God gave an opportunity, opened a door, he was ready. Okay, it's not, God didn't, there's nothing in here that says, oh, God told me that the king would respond this way today. No, Nehemiah prayed, please let the king respond in a positive way. There was nothing guaranteed in that. And when the king questioned him, he said another quick prayer, but there was nothing that said, oh, God answered him directly or anything like that. He's like us. He saw a need. He prayed for an opportunity. He was ready when that opportunity came, when that door opened, and he acted. I like Nehemiah. Nehemiah prayed. God provided the opportunity. Nehemiah stepped through that door and acted, and he kept with it. And we can also see things that need to be done. We can pray, we can plan, and we can be ready to act when God provides opportunity. Ephesians 2:20 says that we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works. If that's why God created us, he's going to give us opportunity to do those good works. Can they be hard? Yeah. Can we feel I can't? Oh, yeah. Can we get going into something and then the shiny new wears off and we get discouraged? Absolutely. Can there be opposition from outside? Yep. Can our family say, yeah, you really shouldn't be doing that? Absolutely. Yes, that's the worst opposition. When it comes, and when you see Nehemiah in chapter 4 here, that he's dealing with the people outside. He's, going, yeah, God, go get them. But then he has to deal with the Jews themselves who say, we can't, we're unable, they're after us. And 10 times he says that they just said over and over, we can't, they're going to get us, we can't. I imagine he got tired of hearing that. But that was inside, and that's the worst discouragement when you're trying to do something good, is when it comes from brothers and sisters in Christ. That had to be harder on Nehemiah than all the outside opposition, because it was coming from within. But his response was still, be brave, God is with us. He said, remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight. That was his answer to those who would discourage from inside. But very good point. That's absolutely true. Any other thoughts? Stunned silence. All right, just to kind of finish up here, because I can actually finish on time. I'm always so proud. I'm always so proud of myself when I finish on time. It's kind of like, it's that balancing act of, thank you. It's kind of like, do I have too much? Do I have too little? That's why when Sam asked me, yeah, well, that's the thing I dock Sam on. If you ask me how he did on something, it's kind of like your time management, my darling. He's not. No. That's why I tell him. That's why I tell him it's kind of like, it's got great lesson. You need to work on your time management. Well, there's a story behind that, but again, all right. So just to finish up here, Nehemiah left an important position in the king's court to help the Jews in Jerusalem. He left a very comfortable place, beautiful place, the king's palace, to go to dirty, grubby, torn down Jerusalem. He went to do a job that was stressful, tiring, and dangerous. And instead of giving in to discouragement, Nehemiah decided that each time there was a discouragement, he was going to pray, and plan and act no matter how difficult the circumstances became. And that's amazing to me each time that he prayed. It's kind of like he heard about the bad stuff, he prays. He goes before he's doing his normal job and the king asks him a question. He takes a second to pray. It's kind of, and it's just amazing to me. It's one of those, it's kind of, oh God, please help me. It's kind of, I've got this opportunity now, and he takes it. And then, these other people come against him. He prays. The people around him, close to him comes again, they're discouraged. He prays over and over and over. He continues to pray. And we can see, just like Nehemiah, we can see things that need to be done. We can pray, we can plan, and we can be ready. But it's easy to be discouraged by all the evil in this world. It's kind of because I can't make it right. That's what I want. I want things to be made right. Well, that's God's job. We've got to hand that over to God. And that is something I struggle with, because even though I know I can't do anything about it, but again, that's a distraction, and that keeps our focus off things that I can do something about. Because if I'm all worried about this other stuff, if Nehemiah was all worried about taking his vengeance on these guys, then it would have distracted him from the work. Yeah. Yeah. We can't focus on the good works that God has for us to do if we're focused on all these other things that are distractions, that are discouraging, that would make us afraid, that would make us feel like I can't, or I should just quit. And that's what discouragement does, that fear. First, it'll tell us I can't, and then it'll say, well, you should quit anyway. Yeah, well, that was a game. And that's okay. That's okay. But we could, we can't make things right in this world. That's not our job anyway. But we can look around, we can see a need, we can pray about it, we can plan, and when there's an opportunity, we can act, knowing that God is with us and God is our strength. And I want to finish with 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58, that reads, "Be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord." Thank you so much for your time and for your comments.